Well, no, they're going to be open. They're going to be open till about 11. I don't know. I think we can really do the opposite. You could watch one channel and take another.
It would be orchestral. I can't wait till the T-Rex.
Why is that?
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Oh, that may take forever.
Too long way.
Ellie, look at this big long thread hanging off my shirt.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, sure, it's a big thread.
Why is it certainly is?
Thread. I'll throw this photo. Huh? Yeah, probably. You want to hear it?
Code of content would be a mapping of what the interior of the content is, what was included, and the exterior, what the absences are, and what's the outtakes. Then there would be a third code, which would be the code of the overriding gestural content of the film. The film is an entire structure, and this might even lead to embedding the film in something else to film, you know. Testing 1, 2, 3. Give you the strain gauge. It could be connected to both a thermograph and a wind speed and direction indicator, so these three things could be correlated simultaneously. It's important to find out the frequency response of a strain gauge, i.e., could it work up in the audio range? If it could, a variable resistance would be useful. Yeah. And external realities. In this sense, the difference between the self and the other is absolutely enormous, because the other is an extrapolation from the external body through the internal apparatus, where the self, in terms of self-identification with classes and so forth, is located in the zone layer that is in between the two. In this sense, we could say that these identifications come from entirely different areas of the mind, which may be a useful approach. The inverse of the superstructural model. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What in the world is going on with this machine? Is it going to continue to work? Tune in next week to see. Perhaps the filament has come off the material. And try to determine the relationship between counting processes. Try to determine the relationship between counting processes, one from another, to see what comes out of it. Second part would emphasize from the block to the symbol, because it's only when you begin considering the symbol within a block, no matter how contradictorily it's presented, can you come to grips with the specifics of action that the block conjures up. As the algebra of blocks plays itself out upon the level of the symbol, that even within a particular block, that symbols play into competing regimes or into totalizations. With the KAL 007 incident, find that this becomes a totalization equated with the evil empire, or the totality of the act equated with the evil empire. And here it might be worthwhile to have a digression to literally dissect the relationship of the act to its symbolic value, the relationship of the specifics of the act to its symbolic value. An immediate thing to notice is how the act itself has led to the notion of a withdrawal. In other words, instead of indicating the necessity for increased communication, because it was obviously on a certain level of breakdown of a communicative act, it's being taken as a necessity for the withdrawal of communications. The withdrawal is also taken up by a circumaction. In other words, the idea is to isolate the Soviet Union, not only to withdraw from it, but to create it as a locus of withdrawal by doing such. It's not that the West wants to withdraw from itself, but it wants to create a condition of withdrawal within the Soviets. That in a peculiar fashion, this goes back to the antiquated notion of the silent treatment. The idea of isolating an individual, isolating a germ or a disease in order to expel it from the body. Here again we have a mechanism of projection going on. Strata. It is as primitive as axiomatic set theory. I don't think so. But an axiomatic should be able to be. Notes on the infinite Hollywood film. It should be a silent film, shot silently, with mag striping, and the sound would then be put on the mag. Ground sound recorded separately on a TC-135. The sound would be a musical score plus reminiscences, a rush, and it would be good to look at the straight 8mm film that was shot of Hollywood to see how that works in that regard. It should be shot in black and white and would include all kinds of pixelation as well as expansions and contractions. For example, not only involving external scenery, but also involving sets, Universal Studios tour, Anaheim, all of those kinds of peripheral activities. Venice Boulevard, a lot of stationary camera work where the camera would be held and people would act for the camera. Say, setting up something for an 11-minute shot on the Venice beach and then seeing what happens and then editing out of that. It would be cluttered and fragmentary, and in this regard, look at the film Hollywood again. The second possibility would be to show the Vigo film and to shoot Atalanta again in Atlanta. Again, work with the cluttered discourse. I want to make you a star, and the two people walking along Hollywood Boulevard under the movie sign with the sunset in the back. It'd be good to get Laura Parker involved on set. That is dealing with it by theory of sets. You could then have complements and so forth. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Approach you're using at the moment depends on the specific mapping, and it's interesting to see that inclusion isn't really required. As a matter of fact, nothing is said about the relationship between photography. And you can use the theory of photography in a way as the theory of the infinite set, because it's a mapping of reality or proceeds from a mapping of reality. For this, use the story Snapshot and the article on Marcia Resnick and the notes on the photographic series.
I don't know how this thing records. I guess it's recording right now.
The 8 forms of looking up from the null set should be written out in a mathematical form to see if they overlap. They can also be...
I can't tell how this records, actually. I think it's recording right now, but I don't know.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In common. Example of A on level 10 and B on level 10 aren't joined until C on level 3. Then they're both subsumed under level 3. Numerical mapping is more indicating
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Of course, numerical.
1, 2, 3, 4. You boy, you have to talk almost right directly into the damn thing.
Call Richard Martin Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday to see what about meeting him, both about the magazine and possibly doing an article called The Organ. Martin. It's you.
This is record right there. Okay.
There's the mathematization one based on a particular numerical mapping. This can be with or without insertions. In other words, a full taxonomy or a partial taxonomy. There's one based on partially ordered sets, which results in a traditional hierarchy. There's an extension of one based on partially ordered sets, which leads to the development of a lattice. That is, by making pseudo-sets, pseudo-collections of attributes, to form a traditional Boolean situation. Then all of this is asynchronous. Then there's also the diachronous, which can be the diachronous taxonomic hierarchy, which can also be mathematicized in much the same way. Even the possibility of intersection holds there. What we should do now is, because these hierarchies are, after all, intentionally created, there's a phenomenology. For example, some of them, such as the set theoretic ones, which require no quantification, seem more natural in a sense than the other kind of indexing. Perhaps the laws indicate a more basic approach, or perhaps they more easily reflect the way the mind works. Certainly they lead, in the sense of a logic of attributes, leads into a traditional Boolean logic. First thing to do, though, is work out the detailed formalization of the various images so they can't be compared. Of some of the diagrams, particularly the synchronic diagram. The synchronic hierarchy should be noted. You better consider in this strange scheme how the breakdown of distributivity does imply intentionality. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hi, Azure. She didn't say anything. Misdefinition of lattice here, because the least upper bound is certainly well defined in this case. In fact, distributivity probably holds. In the real hierarchy, the way it's used, like the word dog or something, or animal, the attributes predate any transformational, any classification procedures. To consider description is as a higher order explanation in which what might possibly be involved has to do with economics. Thus consider the outline of the continent of Europe. Here a description would be simple, especially if it was done either in the form of coordinates or in the form of a map. But the explanation would be extraordinarily complex if it was to take into account all of the details of the boundary. Now this could proceed obviously by a median level geology. That is, specific bays could be explained for particular reasons. But to unite all of this into one global construction, global explanatory construction, would be close to impossible. It shouldn't be, though, that explanation is just on a different level than description. That is, a lower level. But it's also that explanation requires doesn't. For this reason, the most accurate map of Europe, of the outline of Europe, would be an image, not a coordinate plotting. It seems to me simply that both consciousness and the body, material, the world together, so to speak, it would be abstraction. What's pertinent here would be the list of the embedding of consciousness in formal systems. that I drew up for the talk. It's interesting that in the cogito, the I is considered as a unification. That is, it's not divided into its constituent psychoanalytical parts. And yet it's only by this division that the problem really becomes handleable. The only way to consider the ego is probably in terms of trans-categorical analysis. That is, Freud tries on one hand to pin it in part of the cortex, and on the other hand, to consider it as what could only be called a quasi-phenomenological entity. That we can locate it in terms of the cortical control situation, definitely within the diagram of the topology of intention. But the difficulty here becomes the correlate between the control unit, say within a topology of intention, and the phenomenological agent of repression in the theory of instincts. In any case, we can consider it as an editing device within an exchange system of the environment. In this case, threshold logic is extremely important. The threshold being used as a means of identification with the idealization found in the external environment. Between the threshold logic, then, and the classical logic, which can only be inferred, we can place the ego and possibly the superego. The id would reside within the threshold logic. The difficulty seems to be in formulating an abstractional situation, or structuration in other words, as an entity, thus giving what I call the zone system within a topology of intention. It's difficult to see this as an entity in itself, that is, as the ego. One way of looking at the ego in this situation is as a transformation or a transference operation. In this case, there is some resemblance between the ego and the exchange situation, which can be used for the derivation of the economic. We can consider peculiarly enough reductions in both spheres so that both the ego and the economic can be represented in terms of transference or exchange systems. Whereas when we try to deal with higher order levels, that is, when we try to deal with the fine structure of these exchange systems, this is what I think the film should be. As one example, let's say that we did a documentation, we had an hour's worth of film footage, okay? And let's say that you did I'm saying you because you might be able to do this easier than me, or we could both work on it, whatever. But let's say that it had built into it a system of editing based on certain kinds of codes, a codification system. It would have a second codification system, which would have been what was the actual steering mechanism for the shooting of the film in the first place. In other words, what was actually shot and when the shots were turned on and when they were turned off. So you have these two mechanisms which dialectically interact and produce the final film. Somehow what I'd like to do is be able to have the film as a final product and at the same time have those mechanisms, both the one of the actual shooting and the one of the editing, both of those mechanisms completely obvious through the entire showing of the film, so that what you would have would be not only the structure of the film presenting the land, but you would also have the structure of the film making itself obvious, so that in a sense it then becomes transparent. Like one way of doing that would be simply to have some kind of a symbol system, a very simple symbol system worked out, which is easy enough to do, and to have two films running simultaneously, a double screen situation. One of them would be a listing of the actual shots and a listing of why they were chosen and so forth, or whatever information was going to be put on that could be picked ahead of time. That would run simultaneously with the actual film itself. And that would mean that the whole thing, when a viewer watched it, the whole thing would look like a conceptual work, but the conceptual work would be filled with a specific landscape, so the landscape would be transparent, or rather the structure would be transparent in relation to the landscape. The landscape would still come through the complete exposure of the methodology. It's as if, like with L'Origine Centrale, is that the score came through completely.
Elements of the landscape or certain physical situations that exist there. So actually, the landscape is providing the code, which is providing the editing.
Well, two things. The problem partly there is that this would be confusing if you want the landscape itself to don't want to mix it in with the coast. But second of all, the landscape is almost a priori mixed in with the coast, because if we're walking through the landscape and choosing to shoot certain things because of our choices, but it's also that the landscape is presenting, in a sense, presenting these choices to us, so that's going to happen. What I'd rather not do is say, look at a landscape and say, well, we'll shoot the highest peak and then we'll shoot the second highest peak. That's kind of governing.
What I'm saying is it's like the world of self-absorption. Something similar to that, where the thing that is looking is also making the thing that is looking.
Well, that's the point of the whole film, is that that's what occurs. But I don't want to create an artificial situation where that occurs, because it would occur anyway, and that would be part of the point of the film, is to show where it occurs. Then also, I think we should have, maybe even as a series of advertisements, some kind of political statements, because I think to ignore the political repercussions of this whole thing is just wrong. I mean, the primary, is irresponsible. That somebody could look at, say, the Arctic film after it's done, and say something like, oh, just another landscape. Be a way to some kind of distortioning process to make it so unfamiliar that it becomes. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's not a very good sound. The batteries might be low. So that is by revealing how the shots were taken. In other words, having the codes present. Yeah. Except Region Central seems to me to be more about geometry. I mean, I remember I only saw segments of the film, but what I remember out of it is the geometry of the film, not the specific location. I mean, I have general ideas about the location, but it really seems to be much more about the possibility of pure movement in three-dimensional space than it does about a particular central region. Well, I differ with you because I think that it's more of, I consider that to be like a complete documentation of a location. But it's not a complete documentation. But it really isn't. In a sense, it's a restriction. And my as I saw that film, what came to mind was the type of film, was the kind of Mariner type of documentation from an archaeologist. So it was more about the shape. It was more about an interview. But the Mariner, in terms of tolerance theory, it seems mentioned in the natural kind, that is the non-conscious kind. Number one, there is an absolute decision made, an irrevocable decision. And number two, this decision is based on a fixed threshold, not a threshold which is variable. The conditions may be variable, and this may vary the threshold, but the threshold itself remains fixed given a particular set of conditions. But yes, I am in business for myself. Even the thresholding question is one that seems to be coming in for a considerable amount of confusion. A distinction simply must be made between a thresholding which can be represented by a classical logic situation, simply that is a thresholding in which you have a certain amount of input. If you exceed this input, a different change occurs. And a thresholding which results in a qualitative difference instead of a quantitative one, a thresholding which is fluid and flexible. The thresholding that occurs internally, that is within intelligence, does not affect things directly in the physical world. Although this argument too is open to questions if the physical nature of the brain is paired in a parallelism with the mental functioning. One difference is that the thresholding in the brain works by and large by resembling. That is, a situation is repeated again, is read as being a repetition, or is read as being similar to another situation. And this reading then forms the basis for the action, whereas thresholding in a physical situation is simply dependent upon the physical conditions which operate as steering mechanisms. The writing as it now stands is unclear. On one hand, we're talking about absolute thresholding, which is what I'm referring to now as a physical situation. On the other hand, the word thresholding itself is used both to refer to absolute thresholding and to thresholding of mental functioning. These two things are not differentiated at the end of the essay on the autonomy of the mind. Thresholding in physical phenomena is not. Thresholding in mental phenomena may also be automatic or appear automatic to the individual. This is what occurs when tacit frameworks are taken for granted as the basis for the operations associated with behavior. On the other hand, these thresholds, to the extent that they are considered automated, may be considered aspect of the function of the individual operating as a thing. Of course, this again is confusing levels because it's not taking into account the perceptual situation. That is the fact that the thresholding always proceeds by resemblance within a perceptual situation. Just a subconscious. Not is always falsifiable. You end up with a Popperian situation. On the other hand, one could say it could be never falsifiable if one takes into account the possibility of holding an opinion against what a threshold would ordinarily tell you. One should go back to the original text and the structure of reality to see how these issues are worked out. Perhaps the word threshold should simply be restricted to things that happen internally, and something else should be used for things that happen otherwise. But this also imposes a restriction on the difference between thresholding as it occurs within the neuron and thresholding as it occurs within interpretation of mental phenomena. Perhaps one way of looking at it is that thresholding is the foundation for mental phenomena, whereas classical or quantum logic are the foundation for physical phenomena. And not basis for quantum of mental thresholding. The appearance of the same kind of thresholding in physical phenomena, whereas in vice versa, mental phenomena can create the appearance of the classical logic as when one behaves in a particular way time and time again. Abstract reality, but nothing intermediary. If you're given ehia, kasha, ehia, what you're given is a statement of duration from the present into the future, which is paralleled by the use of will in English, where you have will meaning both future tense and will in terms of extension of the body, intentional extension of the body. The ehia functions on one hand as an emblem within a text, and on the other hand as a linearization of the text. It serves as a token, both as a verb and as a philosophical concept of noun. 2. Disturbance, center of the page spelled wrong. JD6, center, symptomatic, not symptomatic. JD7, a little below center, eliminate the E in measurable. 89, bottom, change they to she or he. Page 96, eliminate the in the spirit. Page, general scheme, early version. Add at the bottom.